From the earliest times, from the very inception of organized government, rulers and their officials have attempted, with varying degrees of success, to control their economies. The notion that there is a just or fair price for a certain commodity, a price which can and ought to be enforced by government, is apparently coterminous with civilization. For the past 46 centuries at least, governments all over the world have tried to fix wages and prices from time to time. When their efforts failed, and they usually did, governments then put the blame on the wickedness and dishonesty of their subjects, rather than upon the ineffectiveness of the official policy. The same tendencies remain today. The passion for economic planning, as Professor John Jukes has cogently pointed out, is perennial. Centralized planning regularly appears in every generation and is just as readily discarded after several years of fruitless experimentation, only to rise again on a subsequent occasion. Grandiose plans for regulating investment, wages, prices, and production are usually unveiled with great fanfare and high hopes. As reality forces its way in, however, the plans are modified in the initial stages, then modified a little more, then drastically altered, then finally allowed to vanish quietly and unmourned. Human nature being what it is, every other decade or so the same old plans are dusted off, perhaps given a new name, and the process is begun anew. In the ancient world, of course, authority over the most important economic commodity, foodstuffs, was power indeed. The man, or class of men, who controls the supply of essential foods is in possession of the supreme power. The safeguarding of the food supply has therefore been the concern of governments since they have been in existence, wrote Mary Lacy in 1922. As far back as the 5th dynasty in Egypt, generally dated about 2830 BC or earlier, the nomarch Henku had inscribed on his tomb, "I was lord and overseer of southern grain in this nome." For centuries, the Egyptian government strived to maintain control of the grain crop, knowing that control of food is control of lives. Using the pretext of preventing famine, the government gradually regulated more and more of the granaries. Regulation led to direction and finally to outright ownership. Land became the property of the monarch and was rented from him by the agricultural class. Under the Lagid dynasty, quote, there was real omnipresence of the state. The state intervened by employing widely all its public law prerogatives. All prices were fixed by fiat at all levels, close quote. According to the French historian Jean-Philippe Levy, quote, control took on frightening proportions. There was a whole army of inspectors. There was nothing but inventory, censuses of men and animals, estimations of harvest to come. In villages, when farmers were disgusted with all these vexations ran away, those who remained were responsible for the absentee's production. One of the first effects of harsh price controls on farm goods is the abandonment of farms and the consequent fall in the supplies of food. The pressure the inspectors applied extended, in case of need, to cruelty and torture. Egyptian workers during this period suffered badly from the abuses of state intervention of the economy, especially from the Bronze Law, an economic theory which maintained that wages could never go above the bare necessities for keeping workers alive. The controls on wages set by the government reflected the prevailing economic doctrine. After a period of brilliance, Levy concludes, quote, Egyptian economy collapsed by the end of the 3rd century BC, as did her political stability. The financial crisis was a permanency. Money was devalued. Alexandria's commerce declined. Workers, disgusted by the conditions imposed upon them, left their lands and disappeared into the country. In his very instructive work, Must History Repeat Itself?, Anthony Fisher calls our attention to the king of Sumeria, Urukagina of Lagash, whose reign began about 2350 BC. Urukagina, from the scanty records that have come down to us, was apparently a precursor of Ludwig Erhard, who began his rule by ending the burdens of excessive government regulations over the economy, including controls on wages and prices. A historian of this period tells us that from Urukagina, quote, we have one of the most precious and revealing documents in the history of man and his perennial and unrelenting struggle for freedom from tyranny and oppression. This document records a sweeping reform of a whole series of prevalent abuses, most of which could be traced to a ubiquitous and obnoxious bureaucracy. It is in this document that we find the word freedom used for the first time in man's recorded history. The word is amargi, which literally means return to the mother. We still do not know why this figure of speech came to be used for freedom. In Babylon, some 40 centuries ago, the Code of Hammurabi, The first of the great written law codes imposed a rigid system of controls over wages and prices. Remembering the somewhat limited nature of ancient economies, particularly those as ancient as the Babylonian, it is interesting to note the extent of wage controls imposed by the Hammurabi Code and the explicit way in which they are recorded. A few of the articles of the code will suffice to illustrate this. 257. If a man hire a field laborer, he shall give him 8 gur of corn per annum. 258. If a man hire a herdsman, he shall give him 6 gur of corn per annum. 261. If a man hire a pasturer for cattle and sheep, he shall give him 8 gur of corn per annum. 268. If a man has hired an ox for threshing, 20 kwa of corn is its hire. 269. If an ass has been hired for threshing, 10 kwa of corn is its hire. 270. If a young animal has been hired for threshing, 1 kwa of corn is its hire. 271. If a man hire cattle, wagon, and driver, he shall give 180 kwa of corn per diem. 272. If a man has hired a wagon by itself, he shall give 40 kwa of corn per diem. 273. If a man hire a workman, then from the beginning of the year until the 5th month he shall give 6 grains of silver per diem. From the 6th month until the end of the year he shall give 5 grains of silver per diem. 274, and this is highlighted. If a man hire a son of the people, pay a potter 5 grains of silver, pay a tailor 5 grains of silver, pay a carpenter 4 grains of silver, pay a rope maker 4 grains of silver, he shall give per diem. 275. If a man hire a illegible, her hire is 3 grains of silver per diem. 276. If a man hire a makritu, he shall give 2.5 grains of silver per diem for her hire. 277. If a man hire a 60-ton boat, he shall give a 1/6 part of a shekel of silver per diem for her hire. It is arguable that these controls blanketed Babylonian production and distribution and smothered economic progress in the empire, possibly for many centuries. Certainly the historical records show a decline in trade in the reign of Hammurabi and his successors. This was partly due to wage and price controls, and partly due to the influence of a strong central government, which intervened in most economic affairs in general. W.F. Leemans describes the recession as follows, quote, "Prominent and wealthy merchants were no longer found in Hammurabi's reign. Moreover, only a few merchants are known from Hammurabi's time and afterwards, all evidently minor tradesmen and moneylenders. In other words, it appears that the very people who were supposed to benefit from the Hammurabi wage and price restrictions were driven out of the market by those and other statutes. The trade restrictions laid down by Hammurabi, the protecting king, the monarch who towers above the kings in the cities, as he called himself, were, to some extent, built upon the foundations of the social system developed under his predecessor, Rim-Sin. There was a remarkable change in the fortunes of the people of Nippur and Isin and the other ancient towns that he ruled, which came in the middle of Rim-Sin's reign. The beginning of the economic decline corresponds exactly with a series of reforms inaugurated by him. It appears that the noble monarch, after a series of impressive military victories, succeeded in having himself worshipped as a god, and henceforth took more political and economic power for his own administration and broke the influence of wealthy and influential traders. Thence the number of merchants and wealthy men mentioned in the extant documents declines markedly. The number of property transactions, which records also exist, also diminishes. The number of administrative documents, which today we would call bureaucratic paperwork and red tape, simultaneously increases at a precipitous rate.